Now, something that you may not have thought about before is that not all criminals are good criminals. Now, that's not to say that any criminal is really a good criminal. I'm just saying that some criminals are not very proficient at being a criminal. I'd like to give a couple examples of what I mean by a bad criminal. First example is that there were these two gentlemen, this is a true story, who wanted to rob a nearby store. And they thought to themselves, well, we really need to hide our identity. And so they thought, what could we do? And they thought, I know, we'll get some masks. But they didn't have any masks. And then they thought to themselves, well, what else would work besides a mask? Some face paint. We could paint our faces and nobody would recognize us. But we don't have any face paint. And so they went with the best thing they had, markers. They colored their faces. And they went and they successfully robbed the store. And they're in the middle of the getaway when they got pulled over by the police. And sure enough, they made a crucial mistake, which was this. Instead of using washable marker, they used permanent marker, which means that it was very easy for the police officers to identify them because the marker was still all over their face. Second story. A criminal went in to rob a muffler shop. He went to the desk, told the clerk, give me all your money. Clerk said, I'm sorry, we don't keep any money in the cash register. It's all in the safe, and I don't have access to the safe. And the criminal said, well, who does have access to the safe? And the clerk said, well, actually, only the manager has access to the safe. And the criminal said, well, get me the manager. I want to talk to him. And the clerk said, oh, I'm so sorry. He's out for lunch. And the criminal said, well, when is he going to be back from lunch? And the clerk said, well, he takes some really long lunches. I mean, it could be an hour and a half, 2 hours. I mean, he's even taken a 3-hour lunch before. The criminal got to thinking, I don't really have time to wait around that long. He said, how about this? I'll write down my number and I'll leave it here. And then you give me a call when he gets back. I'll finish robbing you then. As it turns out, if a criminal leaves his phone number at the scene of a crime, it's pretty easy to track him down. Third and final story. Crime of opportunity. Two guys pull into a gas station. Guy driving the car starts pumping the gas. Other guy sees a girl leave her car to go into the gas station. He hops out of the car, runs over to her car, looks in the car, sees she left her purse sitting right there. Car's unlocked. Grabs her purse, runs back, gets in his buddy's car. They take off. A couple days later, he's getting ready to enjoy the fruit of his thieving. And so he goes out for a nice meal. Sits there, orders something expensive. Check comes, pulls out that stolen credit card, gives it to the waitress. And who brings the check back? But the police. You see, what had happened is that the waitress, when she went to go run the card, recognized the name on the card. Why? Because it was her name. It was her stolen purse. Now, this was the part that the police thought was the best, most interesting, and just revealed how bad this guy was at being a criminal. When they went out to the guy's car, the lady's purse was still there in the wallet and all that, and in the wallet was this girl's photo ID. Her license was right there. This guy should have known what the woman looked like that he had stolen from, but yet he didn't put two and two together, even though she was waiting tables the whole time for him. Now, that's what I mean, is that not all criminals are created equal. Not all criminals are good criminals. Some people are bad at being criminals. Now, what does that have anything to do with us? What does that have anything to do with you and me? Well, most likely, none of you are embarking on a life of crime. This isn't a message on how to become a better criminal. But what I've come to realize is that you and I are all bad criminals, and we've all been trying to steal from the same person. And before you get too offended, let me share with you who I think we've all been trying to steal from and what we've been trying to steal. I think we've all been trying to steal from the same person, that's God himself. So you might be wondering, what in the world have all of us been trying to steal from God? And I think it's this: His glory. His glory. And how do we go about stealing God's glory? Well, in reality, because He's the creator and we're the creation, anytime we take credit for things that we really ought not to take credit for, that's trying to steal some of God's glory. Anytime that we allow people to admonish us for our position or for gifts or for talents and we don't give credit back to God, that's us trying to steal His glory. And truth be told, trying to steal from God is a zero-sum game. And so there's something that's very important that we need to learn today as we face this dilemma of trying to steal from God. And so in order to look at this matter, let's open up to the book of Acts, chapter 12. We're going to be in verse 19, the second half. So grab your Bible, open up to Acts, chapter 12, verse 19. Second half of verse 19. Follow along with me. I'm reading from the Holman Standard. Then Herod went down from Judea to Caesarea and stayed there. He had been very angry with the Tyrians and Sidonians. Together they presented themselves before him. They won over Blastus, who was the king's personal attendant, and through him they asked for peace, because their country was supplied with food from the king's country. So on an appointed day, dressed in royal robes and seated on the throne, Herod delivered a public address to them. The assembled people began to shout, "It's the voice of a god and not of a man!" At once an angel of the Lord struck him because he did not give the glory to God, and he became infected with worms and died. Then God's message flourished and multiplied. So real quick, to summarize this passage, Herod Agrippa I, this Herod that's mentioned here, is the ruling king over Israel. Israel is not an independent nation. It's ruled over by the Roman Empire, and so Herod is installed by the Roman Empire to be the king there. North of Israel is these two cities, Sidon and Tyre, where these citizens have come from who are dependent upon Israel's food, particularly that northern region called the Galilee. It's a much more fertile area. And so essentially these citizens from these two northern cities are in this southern city, Caesarea Maritima, Caesarea of the sea, Caesarea by the sea, and they're praising this other king. It's not their king, it's a different king, in order to try to get on his good side, so that way they have the necessary food. So let's ask a couple questions of this passage and see what we can glean from it. Well, first, notice that the very first word that we started with is the word then. Well, that should beg the question, what came before then? Then what? Well, you see in chapter 12, two really key things happen in the life of the church, or the early church. The first thing is this: at the beginning of the chapter, James, the apostle, is martyred. He's killed for his faith by who? By this Herod, by Herod Agrippa I. And the people were so delighted that he arrested Peter and was getting ready to do the same thing to Peter, but Peter ended up being miraculously released from prison. An angel helped him to escape. And the result was that Herod was so upset that he then killed the guards who were responsible that night for watching over Peter. And so these two very tremendous things have happened in the life of the church leading up to this moment. Now, what else do we see here? Well, notice that it says that he's dressed in royal robes. Well, one of the interesting things about this passage is that the same event is detailed by Josephus, a Jewish historian who was writing for the Romans. He details this event, and he describes what these royal robes looked like in more detail. This is what his description says. It says, "On the second day of the spectacles, he put on a garment made wholly of silver, of a truly wonderful texture, and came into the theater early in the morning. There the silver of his garment, being illuminated by the fresh reflection of the sun's rays, shone out in a wonderful manner." And so these royal robes were woven with silver, And what's interesting is that when you go to Caesarea by the sea, today you can go stand in this very same theater that he's in. You see, the biblical text tells us that he's in the city of Caesarea, and then Josephus tells us that it happens in the theater. And what you notice is that the stage of the theater is facing east, and so you can imagine that sun rising up, and just as it comes across the back of the theater seating, that sun ray would shine down onto the stage, and as he's wearing silver, that it would just begin to illuminate, that begin to radiate, having the appearance of glory. One of the Old Testament words for glory is Shekinah, meaning radiant, this radiant image. And so when we think about the fact that Herod Agrippa is the king of Israel and he's standing on the stage of this wonderful city by the sea, by the Mediterranean Sea, and he's wearing this amazing garment and he's sparkling, and people who are not even his countrymen are in the theater and they're chanting the voice of a God and not of a man, it seems like Herod Agrippa's a very impressive person. So what do we know about Herod Agrippa? Because there's a lot of Herods in the Bible. Well, let me give you a little background on Herod Agrippa I. His grandfather is Herod the Great, the same Herod the Great who tried to murder baby Jesus and ended up killing all the males in the area of Bethlehem who were 2 years and younger. Herod the Great was known as being ruthless. Although an amazing architect, and if you travel to Israel, you'll see some of the most amazing architecture you've ever seen in your life that's been preserved for 2,000 years. But when it came to people who threatened him for his throne, well, he was quick to kill people. In fact, he even killed his son, who was Herod Agrippa's father. One writer said that you were better off being Herod Agrippa's dog than Herod the Great's dog than Herod the Great's child, because you were more likely to survive if you were his dog. And so that's who Herod Agrippa grew up under, is his grandfather's legacy of being the last king of Israel. After his father died, him and his mother, Herod Agrippa and his mother, they moved back to Rome, and they grew up in a very prestigious setting. Herod Agrippa I went to school with Emperor Tiberius' son. I mean, he was right there with the royals and the senators' children. I mean, he was in the mix. But he was never that good at really much of anything. If I could use the analogy, he was a few French fries short of a Happy Meal. Not the brightest crayon in the box. Not an overachiever. In fact, after he got done with school, he moved back to Israel, where two of his uncles, Herod Antiochus and Herod Philip, were ruling over different sections of Israel. And he got a job with his uncle because that's all he could do, was get a job with family. It's classic nepotism. And he wasn't very good at that, and so he went back to Rome, and because he was friends with Emperor Tiberius' son, he got a job tutoring Emperor Tiberius' grandson. Wasn't a very good tutor. Made a very, very bad mistake. While he was tutoring the emperor's grandson, he started talking ill about Tiberius himself. And one of the servants overheard him talking ill, and what happens if you talk bad about the Roman emperor in his own house to his own grandkid? You get arrested. So there was Herod Agrippa sitting in jail. Well, another one of his friends, a guy by the name of Caligula, isn't that quite the name? Caligula, became emperor following Tiberius. Now Caligula, being friends with Herod Agrippa I, got him out of jail. Well, what happens next is that Herod Agrippa's uncle, Uncle Philip, passed away. And so Caligula sent Herod Agrippa I back to Israel, and he got to rule over the Transjordan, the Decapolis, the area that was east of the Sea of Galilee. And then 2 years later, Herod Antiochus, his other uncle, died, who was ruling over the Galilee, and then he got put in charge of that. And so now Herod Agrippa I, who just a couple years ago was sitting in prison because of his mouth talking bad about Emperor Tiberius, is now ruling over both of the lands of his two uncles in Israel. Now, Caligula was also not an overachiever, and he was quickly killed off by the Romans. And then during this time period of trying to figure out who the next emperor was, Herod Agrippa I used whatever political clout he had at the time and put his full effort behind getting Claudius the position of emperor. And it helped. And so when Claudius became the emperor of Rome, he remembered Herod Agrippa I, and he did something that was historic. He took Judea and Jerusalem and he put it under the responsibility of Herod Agrippa I. Now, to understand this, nobody had ruled all of Israel since Herod the Great nearly 40 years earlier. You see, because of Jerusalem and the temple and the Sanhedrin, they never had someone rule that much of Israel because it was that hard to control it. That's why they had the position like prefect. Think about the gospel stories and Pontius Pilate, him being the ruler of Jerusalem. And so it was very unique that Herod Agrippa I would be the king of Israel, truly the king of Israel, the first king of Israel since his grandfather, Herod the Great, ruling all of it, and he's not an overachiever. He's not an overachiever. And so it's interesting that he's in this position, and what happens next? Well, as they shout the voice of a God, not of a man, the text says that he doesn't give the glory to God. So God kills him. Well, that seems like a strong reaction, but I want you to think about this. You see, already Herod Agrippa I had martyred James. What we knew from when Paul was persecuting people and Jesus shows up to speak to him on the road to Damascus, Jesus doesn't say to Paul, he doesn't say, why are you persecuting my people? Why are you persecuting the church? Why are you persecuting the saints? He doesn't say that. No, he says, why are you persecuting me? You see, Herod Agrippa I hadn't been persecuting the church. He had been coming after Jesus himself. And then, in this act of idolatrous shouting, he takes it on. He tries to take on the glory of God as though it belongs to him. In that moment, God has had enough, and it's over, and he dies. And it says that he died of worms. That's the same thing as grandfather died of. Now, for some of us, glory is a term that, because it's used so much in Christian circles, it's almost lost its meaning. And so I want to make sure that we understand what this word means. It's in Hebrew, there's two terms that describes what glory is. I mentioned the first one. It's Shekinah, meaning radiant. So think about Moses coming off of Mount Sinai, his face being so bright that they have to veil it. That's the Shekinah glory of God. But the other word for glory is the word kavod, and that means heavy. Like there's an elephant sitting on your chest and it's hard to breathe, heavy. And then in the Greek, what's used here in the New Testament is the word doxa, which is essentially these two concepts, both Shekinah and kavod, of radiant and heavy put together. Like it's think about something, a situation that overwhelms you, and you go, oh, that's so heavy. And then think about something that's so bright that you look away, you can't even see it. That's the glory of God. And you see, God is glorious. God doesn't become more glorious because people prescribe him glory. People can simply only describe him as glorious because that's who he truly is. And man is not glorious. It doesn't matter how much people prescribe this quality of God to Herod Agrippa I, he doesn't become filled up with glory. No, man's response must be, in light of a glorious God, humility, humble, So for you and I, our view of ourself in light of a glorious God must be humility. And so I would encourage you, I would beseech you, I would just challenge you that you would be pursuing a mentality, a way of looking at yourself, an identity rooted and based in humility. That in light of a glorious God that we serve, that we would live humble lives as a response to that. There's a story I want to share as we close. In 1715, King Louis XIV of France died after a reign of 72 years. He called himself the Great, King Louis the Great. And he was the monarch who made the famous statement, "I am the state." His court was the most magnificent court in all of Europe in the 18th century. And his funeral was to be equally as spectacular as his reign as the king. And so he gave very specific instructions that his body should be put into a gold casket, and it should be in the center of a very large church, and that he wanted everyone possible to be in that church, and that he wanted one candle glowing above that casket. And they followed everything to a T. So here are these thousands of people gathered in when he died for his funeral. There's his casket, there's the candle, and the candle is coming off of that gold casket, and it's just radiating light throughout the whole dark church. And when the pastor got up to speak, the bishop, this is what he did. And he put out that candle, and this is what he said: "Only God is great."